fell again. I fell a third time. Can't get away from the sin. I keep falling. Then I come back to you, crawling, asking forgive me now I'm ballin', knowing that I let you down, appalling. I don't wanna jeopardize my calling. When I hear your voice no more I'm halting. I just wanna live in the world you're revolving. I am so imperfect I'm getting involved in these flesh-tied friends, the blind consulting, pulling me away from the world and revolting. Asking for forgiveness is probably insulting, but you keep taking me back and you're vaulting. Give me chances. You keep giving me chances. You give me chances. You just keep giving me chances. King. Royalty, stand up, brand up, fam up, hand out, no way, hands up, know what, name that, it's mine, claim that, it's time, message, we shine, above all, the decline, the darkness cannot last, the shadow of my past, before I gain knowledge of heritage, I have the bloodline that I share, most powerful out here, the mover of mountains is who I am touting, the richest among us is who I'm the son of, from sundown to sun up, that's how I then come up, position is just mine, the favor in due time, can't have it, man you lying, the powerless you trying, enemy beneath me, there's nothing to teach me, the people receive me, cause my God complete me, and my God does keep me, and my God they free me, and my God redeem me, and my God relieve me, I'm king since the million crown me, I am winning my position, God's giving, God's in it, God's chosen king. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Elevation Podcast. My name is Shawn, Riff-Raff. I am here, sitting here with someone I think that you guys will find incredibly interesting. He has a lot of stuff to say. He has a really interesting perspective. I can't wait to get into a conversation with him. He is Matt Sandoval. Did I pronounce your name right? Sandoval?
Sandoval works, but for those of you who speak Spanish, they're used to hearing it as Sandoval. So we'll get to
that. Man, how are you doing today, man?
I'm wonderful, especially because it rained in Phoenix. So I'm in Goodyear, which is west of Phoenix. It hasn't rained here in like 110 days. So
wow.
Yeah, it's been pretty dry this year. So on top of all the other stuff we're dealing with, it's been unseasonably warm, and then it rained today. So I actually sat outside to enjoy the rain. We do it opposite Phoenix. We don't hide away from that. We want to be in the middle of it.
How does the pandemic in Phoenix and you said it's Goodyear, right?
Yeah, I'm in Goodyear, which is just west of Phoenix. So I'm 20 minutes from downtown Phoenix. Yeah.
Okay. How does it, like we're in DC, so it's pretty, chaotic as far as, the way things are going here. What is it like in Phoenix?
It's not good. So, Arizona had a pretty big wave right after the initial lockdown, shutdown orders lifted. And then it took us about 6 weeks until the end of June to kind of say, hey, everybody, masks are, advisable. Social distancing really ought to be followed. So unfortunately, the politicalization of that whole situation impacted us here. So as it stands now, we are actually worse off in terms of case numbers in our local jurisdiction than we were in the wave in June. So it's we've had more compliance. I think people are doing the public health measures. What's I think hurting us is that people are getting tired of it, and we're hitting the holidays. And they're taking that risk of like, my friend Tim, he can't possibly have it. Let's go to Tim's house and watch the fight. And then a week later, everybody who was there has a cough, and it's a situation. So yeah, it's not good. It's not affected my family directly. So we're blessed for that, but we've been, fairly cautious. I have some extended family that have serious chronic conditions, and we don't want to expose them to anything we don't need to. So yeah.
It's it hasn't affected my family directly as far as anyone having it, which is great. it has affected us conveniently. We had Thanksgiving prayer and Thanksgiving, so every year we sort of stand around the table and we say what we're thankful for. So it was a lot of us, so we all just kids and everything. Everybody got to talk about what they're thankful for, and so we ended up doing it over Zoom and doing the prayer over Zoom. And so we kind of had to households. So in that case, it's inconvenient, and so it's really it's a tough thing, and like you said, how much has been politicized has really affected, and because this is DC, the how much is politicized, it's affecting how everyone acts. How many people come to DC? I think there's another march happening this weekend, right? Another march of a whole bunch of people from out of town happening this weekend, and so these marches are like, man, stay home,
Yeah.
but they can't. But it's just so political.
Well, and
So
it's just a reminder that even with the guidance about wearing a mask, 6 feet is better. So even if you're
right,
wearing a mask and around someone who's infectious, you're still asked to quarantine. So
right,
that mask is not bulletproof. That 6 feet, plus. So yeah, I understand. It's
yeah,
been a year for that because there's been so many um, groups, some particularly here over the summer, that were protesting and
yeah.
righteously, I think, but all with risks. Everything we do carries some risk unless you're willing to hide out in your room in your home and never leave, which is not practical.
Right. Yeah. Man, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do,
Hmm.
because I want to jump into it. I don't want to. I really, because I know there's going to be some great conversation here. I want everybody to be able to listen in. Tell us what it is that you do, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, true. I'm kind of rare here. I'm a Valley native, so most people from Arizona are from California,
Hmm.
or other states. But I grew up here. I grew up in a Christian home. I
Sure.
like to joke that I have at some point swung on every branch of the tree of the Jesus movement. So my grandparents were like Pentecostal, went to Baptist church, went to Christian church. I mean, now as a professional, over 20 years of experience running nonprofits,
Right.
well, nationally known ones, and one that's local and serving. Really, to me, it's always been important to serve people that need extra support. They're vulnerable.
Mm.
They've experienced some type of limitation, whether it be education, or those that have made mistakes and need a second chance. So
Yeah.
those are different areas that I've been involved in. I'm currently about to finish, hopefully in May, just a few months away, a second master's degree in social work. So my next goal, Matt 3.0 or 4.0, is to get a license to be a therapist and so to add in a consultation piece to what I do.
Hmm.
So the older I get, the longer it takes to answer that question of what you do. But ultimately, I'm really motivated to do greater good in the world. And I use faith as an inspiration for that. But
Hmm.
I'm also, very much committed to the fact that we have reason and intellect and connection and social cohesion. And these are all elements that help build stronger communities by assisting individuals. And some of that requires us to be public advocates. It
Right.
also requires us to be privately empathetic and to be very
Hmm.
supportive. It also requires us to sometimes find ways to compromise with those who don't agree about the way that we should go solving a social problem. So, about 2.5 years ago, as an extension of my own kind of journey and faith in the world, I started a podcast called Practice Makes Presence. And I think that's how we got connected. And
Right.
my motivation there is to cultivate deeper compassion and wisdom. So that's rooted in faith. About half the episodes are somehow focusing, thinking, reflecting on this massively life and world changing event of Jesus in the world and what he does
Right.
for us, and then taking a look at the social sciences, applying that to issues of justice, and believing that that's a biblical theme that believers are asked to be part of. And then as my growing expertise in mental health takes hold, finding ways to model and teach others to really be okay with their emotional life. And there are definitely not the American way to just be really transparent, open with, what's really bothering us. And we're way more motivated in our behavior by our emotional weather than most people give credit for.
Absolutely. Hey, absolutely. Um, I to think about your thinking on your background and the sort of space you've come to in a social justice place. I want to ask you about some of the things that are on the minds of people that that are in my circle or that watch me,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes down to things like the how the evangelical church or evangelical, yeah, let's just say movement church, um, has approached social issues. Has approached social issues. So you've got one circle of people that sort of see social issues as a systemic problem, and then we have another a group of people who see social issues as more of an individual problem. And I think my audience is more of the systemic audience.
Mm-hmm.
And we see social issues from a systemic point of view, and a lot of people feel like the evangelical movement hasn't doesn't care or doesn't acknowledge that the other way of thinking. Where I say a lot of the people that watch my show would be in that that pot over here. How do you see social justice? How do you see it from your point of view? Like, how do you see what does it mean to you? How is it biblically, how is it biblically supported from your point of view?
Yeah, first I would say the thing I'll talk about with anyone on this subject is as we interface and discuss this any of these topics, it's important for us to let go of our thinking that is either or.
Right.
Social justice
I
is
agree.
either great and biblical or it
Mm,
is anti-biblical. Because
mm,
here's the phenomenon of American life, right? You could be in a big city and have five churches within half block and get five opinions, okay?
yes,
And you get
absolutely.
five
You
opinions. And so we're already living in a both and, except
right,
when we self define our takes on this, we don't give that kind of room. And we have to give
yeah,
ourselves a little bit of break because it's a lot easier psychologically and cognitively to just say this is good and that's bad
right.
versus recognizing that both things can be true,
Mm-hmm.
that there are moments where people contribute to their life circumstance in ways that we wish they would make other choices, better choices.
Right,
And then there are people who are as free as their options. So they are the current recipients of a long lineage of and um, oppressed people in the world. Now, it's hard for some people to accept that that's the case in the United States.
right,
Home of the free and land of the brave. But the stats don't lie, right? And
right.
so this is where social science kind of fits in. When you look at there are disparities in education
Sure.
among ethnicities and races. There are still wide disparities in healthcare, health outcomes.
Yep.
In Phoenix, you can be 9 miles apart by zip code and have 10 different years on your average life expectancy. How is
Wow.
that possible in the same city?
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage anyone who thinks like that can't be true, look at your own. Look at your own
Mm-hmm.
city. Look
Right.
at the health disparities that exist. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of answering your question, which is massive. I mean, people write many books and get many PhDs in all elements of this. So it's
Yes.
a big, big topic. But I also have the lived experience of growing up, like I said, kind of swing on every branch of the Jesus movement tree.
Sure.
And went to a Bible college. I was a youth minister for a couple of years, very conservative place. Like, it's a conservative Baptist school. And I don't really identify with some of their areas of emphasis.
Hmm.
Ultimately, I think we're in the same club. Like, it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Right.
And it took me the lived experience of encountering the work of that people did around the historical Jesus and putting him
Hmm.
in this time period where, instead of being born a rich Roman descendant, that we are, in the Christian tradition, praying to, focused on, and contemplating someone that was born on the outskirts as a marginalized person, as somebody with low income. I mean, all of the poor descriptors that we might give people in society, the
Yeah.
person that's our object of worship embodied these. And I think that tells us something about God, if we're honest.
Right.
And one of the things that was pointed out to me, I'll highlight it to anyone who wants to read it, but I recently read Reading While Black from Esau McCaulley. And
Hmm.
he's got his scholarly chops. Like, he got his PhD at in St. Andrews under N.T. Wright, which, I mean, you
Hmm.
can't really get too much higher in the scholarly world.
I
But
love him.
he went he went through
Love.
so many New Testament passages that I know of, and showed me things I hadn't seen. One of them that comes to mind is, like, even when in Luke, which is my favorite gospel,
Hmm.
and so the Advent season is so exciting for me to be able to reconsider all of these stories again. When John the Baptist makes his appearance, I mean, it's a pretty strong message. It's
Right.
not like, come to my church, I'm going to teach you how to be life, live life a little bit better. Like, the message is repent, by a guy with
Hmm.
wild hair who eats weird things and wears weird clothes. Okay. And then he gives this message, quoting Isaiah the way Luke 3 lays it out. And he calls them a brood of vipers.
Hmm.
So again, we're kind of like ticking off all the lists of, like, not very nice Christian world. And he doesn't even know what a Christian is, right? He's a
Right.
prophet within what he thinks is a Jewish lineage, right? And we
Right.
are descendants of that. And then the crowd says, "What? We hear your message. What shall we do?" And every generation since then hears a message about this and has
Hmm.
to answer, "What should we do?" And
Right.
his first answer is, if you have two coats, give one away.
Right.
If you have extra food, give it away.
Right.
And then it tells us this really radical thing, that tax collectors were also baptized that day. And he
Hmm.
tells them, you can no longer go out and benefit from your lifestyle by taking advantage of people.
Hmm.
And that's Luke 3:14. I mean, it's really there. It's all part of the message. And this is the pre-announcement to this
Right.
this figure of worship and object in the Christian tradition that we think is the ultimate manifestation of God, that the conditions are such that when Jesus and his prophets appear, we have a response of, what shall we do? And that what shall we do has something to do with our environment, with the people that
Yeah.
are around.
Yeah.
So I'm in between both, in that there's a real science behind social justice. It
Hmm.
impacts education, it impacts quality of life, it impacts health disparities, and these injustices, they all flow from these isms. I mean, not just racism, but sexism, ableism, and people get very
Yeah.
concerned, like, oh, I might say the wrong thing. Well, imagine just being the wrong kind of person toward
Right.
this group, right?
Right.
It's Don't get lost in the language of what's the right thing to say. I think anyone with an open heart recognizes when they've hurt someone's feelings, right?
Right.
Makes that adjustment. So I see that the social sciences inform a how to,
Yeah.
but our inspiration is that
Yeah.
when we encounter the message of this Jesus in Luke, who is Simeon is told, is said of in chapter 1 to have been praying for the consolation of Israel. You
Hmm.
console people who are in grief.
Mm-hmm.
And why are they in grief? Because they are at the back end of this captivity. They are oppressed. They are a captive people who are not living free to worship God as they see fit. And this man is being presented as having prayed for this Messiah, and his blessing is that God allows him to see this baby. And every time we see this baby, this child, and the prophet like Saint or John the Baptist around him, we all in each generation have to wrestle with, what shall we do? So when we look back at the beginnings of these gospels, I think it's an introduction for all of us to recognize that this baby, young boy who becomes a man, who speaks to crowds, who splits those crowds. So we
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be too shocked that we have that happen here. Calls us to answer that question, what shall we do? And it
Yeah.
requires us to make some choices about the way we live.
Right. One of the things that I feel like um, is getting really, really massively confused is I think that these days people are questioning their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, what you see in the world begins to make you question whether or not what you have been believing is even real or relevant or worth believing when you see leaders that maybe once you looked up to say the opposite of your experience.
Mm-hmm.
And and so I've been, I think I've been struggling a lot these days to really because I feel like, when looking at things like, social justice issues, you've got this split between racial lines in church, or in the faith, in which you see, you felt like you saw that split, sort of going away at one point. You felt like you saw that split kind of, the line of that split beginning to be blurred a little bit, and it changing. And then recently you've seen like, oh no, it's that line is still there, and it seems like we're more divided, but down the lines of racial faith. And so there are a lot of people who are simply questioning faith altogether, as if faith is the actual problem. And so I know, so when you, so I guess my question is, have you ever thought about those particular issues, like people who begin to see social problems and then begin to question their own faith over the problems that they're seeing, because they see the split in the actual faith? Like you said, you can be in the same city and 5 different churches tell you 5 different things. But, if one of the things the church is telling you is it's kind of painful to your truth, what's the lesson that you would have, or what's the thought that you would have in talking to that particular person that is questioning the faith because of what they are experiencing, or what they, versus what they see?
Well, the first thing I would advise someone, because if they were like any of my experience, they'd never heard this, which is give yourself a break. Just
Yeah.
stop. Okay. Just let's take it all in, because it can be a lot to swallow, right? If you're in an environment where there's trauma, you're exposed to it, you see real suffering, it can be very hard to find any reason for hope. That's a natural and normal reaction to something that should not be happening. Now, I think it's very helpful to point out to people that another way of reading the word faith, which typically gets thought of as correct content, right? So to have faith means if I know the right facts about Jesus, then
Right.
I will live the following way. But it has more to do with loyalty. And I came to a place where I had to recognize that regardless of how I felt um, about the big questions of life, that God was always being faithful and loyal to me in my experience. That I, as a human being, am placed in a unique time and a culture, in a specific place with a network of people. And the great existential philosophers, one of their contributions that I've stolen is, you didn't ask to be born. Okay.
Right.
So just give yourself a break. Like, these are tough questions and these
Right.
are difficult questions. And then as we return back to the Gospels, I encounter a Christ who embodies these same questions, right? And the I think that there's a couple novel things about Christianity that stand up against the other major world religions. And I'll be honest, there are some elements of the others that have some pretty instructive things that help me be a good Christian.
Right.
And when I think about what the unique contributions of Christ are in the Christian story, is that God is this manifestation, the full manifestation of God is in Jesus, then that means Jesus knows what it's like to go to a cross unfairly, to be mistreated,
Yep.
to be misunderstood, to be abandoned. I mean, I
Yeah.
have it written down on my notepad, and I don't have the answer yet, but it's between Matthew and Mark. There are two versions of this garden speech. Father, all things are possible, one says, and I think it's Mark says, if these things are possible. And to
Yeah.
me, that's the real human experience of knowing that what's about to come is something I do not want, and
Right.
praying out that I wish it were not so. And to me, the difference in the Christian life is that all an if, like God's power, God's goodness, God's love, that is something that we strive to experience and to enjoy. And yet,
Absolutely.
even Jesus in the garden experiences an if.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we
Right.
can avoid this,
Right. Take
we
this
should
cup from me.
avoid this.
Yeah.
And the story having our advantage, which is we get to read past the Gospels into Acts, is that God does vindicate Jesus. And an
Mm-hmm.
important part for me is that God is just, God is merciful, and that evil is real. And
Mm-hmm.
it is really hard if you abandon some fixed moral elements, then it becomes harder to judge and to make assessments of things that are evil, right?
Right.
Uh, and as we experience things, this is something I'm talking about a lot because I just read about it and now it's like the idea of the day. But this is from Andrew Sung Park, and he is a theologian who talks about a cultural phenomenon in Korea called Han. So Han is like loosely brokenheartedness,
Mm-hmm.
trauma might be a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
So it is partially sin, like sin causes Han, but Han is so much bigger. So think about, like, when we think about sin, we're like, don't lie, don't cheat on your taxes, don't punch
Right.
the neighbor's dog, and
Yeah.
then obviously much more serious things, right?
Right.
Well, his contribution to this concept of looking at the cultural idea of Han is that so many of these small slights add up to big social and cultural conditions of a
Sure.
Han that people experience, live in, and breathe without having any guilt for it. They didn't
Yeah.
cause it, they didn't do it, they live underneath it. So
Right.
anyone who's ever lived under the poor choices of other people who've suffered from that, they know what that means. The trouble with Han is that it also creates more opportunity for resentment,
Right.
for repeating that hurt. So there's a saying in kind of therapy land, hurt people, right?
Absolutely.
So when I encounter people that are that rigid, that angry, it is work that I have to do in empathy to recognize that this is all coming from real hurt.
Right.
And it's a hurt I think at God's heartbeat wants to address and wants to solve. So to your friend who is struggling with faith, I've been there, I understand it. You think the utility goes out the window. But what I come back to is that that same feeling is actually part of Jesus' story. I mean, you cannot really have a crucifixion, you cannot have a resurrection without dramatic, radical separation. I mean,
Mm.
the world changed, the universe changed around that event, and
Absolutely.
it doesn't underplay all of the suffering that went before it. And
Right.
that is one of the cruel things that sometimes we do. It's not just Christians, well, many Christians who do this. give platitudes, right? It'll all work out. Good things work out for those who love God, right? All
Right.
things work according to his purpose. No,
Right.
there are some tragedies that are just that
They're
full
tragedy.
manifestation of Han, and there are no explanations. And
Right.
to sit with those people who suffer that way is to, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is to sit in the garden with Christ himself. In
Right.
between all, God can do all things, and if you can do this, and at the end of the day, we walk the path that's for us, right? Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so that's a lot of how I try to address it. But I mean, very bluntly, give yourself a break. There are a lot of people who deal with this, and I didn't know about this as a young person, but there's a whole field of spiritual direction out there. You can go find people that are, mentor type, leadership type people that have struggled with these big questions. It's
Right.
it's not the kind of mentoring to get a job or to be a better parent. It's about taking care of your soul. And so if you've
Right.
got those big questions, I think spiritual direction is something that can be a remedy for that.
One thing you mentioned a lot, that I've heard you mention, and I want to, I talk a lot about this subject whenever I write, or, when we talk about trauma that has happened to an individual, particularly, you know, particularly non-physical trauma. So, particularly trauma that's happened in your emotional life, and then your responses to it, and how you live your life. And I think a lot of what we have done, and just well, from my point of view, is Christianity, but in generally speaking, is in religion, we have more so wanted to dictate a person by behavior, or change their behaviors, without changing the person. If someone is dealing with trauma that they have experienced in their life, you know, what is your, because a lot of people will behave a certain way based on trauma. So, a person will have issues, a young man have issues with his mother, and so he'll take advantage of women, or have issues with his father, and he'll take advantage of women. And, or there are a lot of different things that leads to behaviors. And so how does one, when dealing with certain things, how can you identify that in your life? And in Christian, in faith, how do we deal with it from a Christian point of view,
Right.
versus the, I guess the thinking, I'll call it this because I can, the lazy thinking of just act right.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, in like some psychology circles, they call it stinking thinking, right? Like the way we think about things ends up being manifested in the way we behave. So
Right.
let me say this, because I definitely grew up in a lot of places where, when you're struggling with very common human faults, right,
Right.
you might be directed back to some probably very famous New Testament passages, mostly New Testament, sometimes in the Old Testament, but that are pastoral advice. You know what I'm saying? Like, this person was writing at a specific time, right? We neglect the humanity of some of these letters, that somebody was
Right.
giving specific advice to a specific scenario, in which we might be able to glean some insight and wisdom, and it
Right.
might partially hit, and it might, totally hit and cover it all, or it might go, I got more questions. Which a
Right.
good pastor does what?
Yeah.
Answers the questions. And I think that we know this because the Corinthian letters are at least 3 or 4. Like, what we know as First Corinthians is really a second letter in a series.
Right.
And they take the pattern of, we sent him this question, he gave us this answer. And guess what happens? We don't like your answer, Paul, try again. right? Like, and
Right.
he gets mad. So the humanity's all over these pages of like, don't you get it? And he is very concerned about their the way they're living, um, because it will bring undue attention, to them in a political setting. Um, they are all in the process, and I think this will be common for a lot of our listeners, right? They're in a city with many temples. Like Corinth was a big,
Right.
big port city,
Right.
and they're the temples to everything you need for a good time, right? It's a party
Hmm.
town, and they are trying to live differently, and it's a struggle. So,
Yeah.
to your audience, if you're in the middle of that, you're in very good company. But to go back to these traumas and these things that happen to us, what when I encounter people and that are working out a behavior they found to not be, let's just say it's maladaptive, right? Like it's a way of coping. It's definitely a way of coping. It's not a good
Sure.
way, right? Very good example of that. That's pretty benign is denial, right?
Right.
So I can push away things. And we're seeing examples of that everywhere right now. People who get
Right.
sick and don't want to get tested for COVID, you, you know, people who make other choices around that whole phenomenon. Denial is a coping mechanism. Is
Right.
it a good one? That becomes another question.
Mm.
And does it hide you from the truth? Does it hide you from a truth that could bless your life? And we've
Hmm.
also been trapped into thinking that we must either be happy or sad. And if we're sad, we must return to happy land. When in
Right.
reality, life with all of its big traumas and little traumas gives us room when we are wise to have both at the same time. So I
Hmm.
can be happy in my relationships with others and, growing in those while I'm still sad about things that have happened to me or things that are not going well in my world.
Sure.
So deep down, and I think you mentioned, I know you've done several podcasts, with like groups of men who are all working toward, better, better relationships, better living,
Absolutely.
really reflecting God's mission in the world. I mean, that's all wonderful. And what I think is helpful for people that are not, really versed in kind of like the psychological sciences, and they approach things very rigidly with, a very simple verse will fix it all, is that whatever behavior is in front of you, someone has selected because it meets a need.
Oh,
It
that's
meets a,
good.
it meets a need. Okay,
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we're going to excuse abusing somebody. Doesn't mean we're going to excuse neglecting somebody. But this choice meets a need. So it might be to lower down emotional weather. Like I can't take it. I know a lot of tough guys, big tough guys that can't handle sad movies, can't handle
Right.
the one-to-one conversations. Like you can bench
Right.
350, but you can't talk about something sad that happened to you. Like what's
Yeah.
true strength,
Right.
right? I mean, back to Christ, I encounter somebody who, even though he knows he's going to raise Lazarus, cries with his friends
Absolutely.
because God knows what it's like to
Absolutely.
suffer, what it's like to suffer, and that making my friends sad is an awful experience. And that I wonder how many times he cried for the people he didn't heal.
Mm.
We know that had to be the case because there was still suffering in our world, right?
Right.
So back to what we were saying about behaviors, it meets a need. And ultimately, it kind of comes down to in that embedded center of you are really two things happening constantly. There is a vulnerable child,
Hmm.
right? Somewhere along your life, you were vulnerable. Like humans are unique among all other living things because we cannot take care of ourselves for a decade plus. I mean, and marginally at that, like a 12-year-old could probably survive, but it would not be very successful, right? We absolutely are wired to depend on other people.
Yes.
And many people experience severe neglect, either of physical nature or emotional nature, and it makes them continue on in that vulnerable child stage.
Hmm.
And then on the other side is an angry child, somebody who's been suffered and has enough, self-esteem, self-determination to say what has happened should not happen anymore, right? And
Hmm.
Christianity is famous for pathologizing anger, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Except the word is be angry, right? And
Right. And
not
sin not.
and
Yeah.
not sin not. Like there's
Yeah.
it's not it's a both and. Like how can I express that deep down need in a way that meets it? And that's the real bravery I think of working out close with people, is teaching them, okay, we've got this totally maladaptive behavior. So it could be addictive behavior. It can be broken relationships. I mean, there's all kinds of attachment wounds that happen to people that keep them from bonding properly to others.
Yeah.
But these things can be relearned. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, I feel like our experience with God is the ultimate attachment, right?
Mm.
Back to those ideas of faithfulness and loyalty. When we experience that, that gives us room to grow that into our lives. And unfortunately, people who are mistreated by their parents have a tendency to project those attitudes right onto God, right? So if you
Right.
view God as distant and neglectful, and you take a good look at your family history, you could do this. You can search for genograms online and follow it. But people develop and they relationally track their families to see, like, what are the tendencies of my family? Do we
Mm.
cut each other off forever? Like, we're talking
Mm.
brothers and sisters who don't
Right.
talk anymore.
Right.
These are all things that I think there is good wisdom in the world that can complement the behavioral goal that the scripture might tell you.
Mm.
So sometimes what can feel like is lacking is, okay, that's great. I should act this way. I don't know how to stop feeling this way
Right.
in order to act in this other way that should be better. Like, I know this is good, but I'm kind of slipping back into my old patterns because it seems to work. And it feels like it works because it's a
Mm-hmm.
real need. We've just got to
Sure.
figure out a way to meet it.
Right. Wow. I'm so as you're talking, it makes me, um, it makes me, think about a whole lot of different scenarios, um, but that I want to throw at you. But I won't do you too tough. But as I'm thinking about, you talked a little bit about parents. There are, there's a lot of people who have leadership, have been subject to poor leadership, especially in the church or in the faith, have been subject to, I guess, the expectations of what they expected from their faith leaders, and have just been incredibly disappointed or incredibly let down or incredibly hurt,
Mm-hmm.
in places in which they came vulnerable and with a need, and so they came into this place, into this emotional place, or the spiritual place of need or vulnerability, and they were hurt or let down. Um, how can one heal? A lot of times that turns us away from the institution of church altogether, and and we end up walking this life, without direction because of what happened in the institution. And so, what what are your thoughts on that? How could one heal in that manner, and bring themselves to be able to trust the institution again? And and how should they look at church,
Yeah.
for once they get past that hurt?
Yeah, as a point of honesty, I mentioned I've grown up, in various Christian churches, but I also didn't attend for a pretty solid block. And
Yeah.
I mean, I know those hurts you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
I've looked backwards and gone, like, every church I've gone to's had this massive moral leadership failure and a
Hmm.
split and this. And honestly, if I'm going to join a club, it's going to be, Sam's Club. It's just much less drama.
Right.
And I get the $1.50 hot dog and all of that.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's awesome. It's
and
nice
so
and
yeah,
big.
I know, and and I want this to be the truth because there's some room for cynicism because the cynicism comes from that hurt. Like, I
Right.
don't want to be part of this.
Yeah.
And so a couple of things. First, it's our human tendency to elevate. We need people. Then some of our leaders, unfortunately, are so insecure that they've adopted personas that look perfect, that are
Hmm.
really designed again to meet a felt need of never really being seen, right?
Hmm.
And need to be perfect. So they are just humans too. They have a
Yeah.
vulnerable child and an angry child,
Hmm.
and I had enough patterns. I mean, I when I was in college studying to be a youth pastor, I was helping out at a church, and I remember talking to the pastor. We could tell he kind of lost the passion. I remember knowing that I needed to meet with him because he needed to sign off on my hours for school, and because I was basically interning in some small way. And he, on a Sunday afternoon, um, said, "Come see me on Thursday," and then shook my hand. And then he proceeded to leave town with his girlfriend and never talk to us for ever. Like, I have no idea what ever happened to him, but the church split. It no longer exists. I mean, this was 20 plus years ago. And I was angry. I understand that anger, being betrayed. It's a very real betrayal,
Yeah.
right? We
And it
want
hurts.
our faith relationships to be more than family. We want people to really support us and to love us. And it took me a long time to realize how much pain that individual had to be in, that he would go through motions week after week and then even pretend to make an appointment with me, knowing he's never going to follow it. I mean, so bizarre, but he was just done. So those things are very hurtful. So how do we move out of that? Well, I think part of it is recognizing that you don't have to be up front with the microphone to be a leader. And in
Yeah.
fact, the wisdom really is coming from around you.
Yeah.
So it can be people a generation ahead of you that have just seen some life that can believe and love you. You giving that same impact to younger people. I mean, this is the church at work. The church is not unlike any other group that needs to work out its traumas,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Most
there
definitely.
are groups that will train and work with people to do that. And so if it's at a collective level, it really does need a specialist who can come and work with that kind of hurt. So these are leadership failures and things like that. But ultimately, for the individual here is I think it's good for all of us to remember that, of all the kind of things that we are to avoid that are talked about, is particularly in the New Testament, but it's certainly a theme in the Hebrew scriptures, is idol worship. And we can make idols out of things that pretend to look like Christianity or Christian things. And when we realize that those things are there, we have an opportunity to refill it with something else. And it
Yeah.
isn't the idol of one person's totally unique way of preaching that we feel like we can never understand the scriptures if they're not around anymore. And ultimately, we have the opportunity, if we are ready to see it, that there's wisdom all around us that can comfort us. Sometimes it's in church.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can still be motivated by Christ's love and not be in the church, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not giving an advertisement here for people to leave or go or do any of those things. I want to validate that you're hurt. If this is something that has happened to you, it's real.
Right.
You've got that vulnerable child and an angry child, and they're probably both mad. And what do they
Yeah.
both need, right? A vulnerable child needs to be soothed. And so here's my message. What happened to you should not have happened. What hurts is real, and it's gonna hurt. And the only way through hurt is to live with it, to coexist with it, not to suppress it, not to use fancy quotes to minimize it.
Right.
And then that angry child, what does an angry person want? I mean, anyone in customer service knows that if you reflect someone's complaint accurately and address it 9 times out of 10, they're thrilled. They just want to be heard. They want to be validated. So,
Yeah.
in my little message here, I want you to be validated. And I also want to know that there are people who know what it feels like to be in your shoes, and soothing is possible to recover from those things.
Yeah. Not to because I want to throw some another thing at you. I know we got limited time, but um, you bring value, so
No worries.
um, so not to totally bash church and church leadership, because September 2019, Jared Wilson, the youth pastor, committed suicide. Right? You remember that scenario?
Yes.
Um, and statistically speaking, a lot of pastors struggle with things like depression. And what, as a leader of a church, or a leader, a faith leader, let's not say leader of a church, who knows, but as a leader, a faith leader, where all of these people are pulling from you on a regular basis, how can you avoid the depths of depression, and how much the people around you need you, or feel like they need you, or pull at you, and how do you avoid that? Because you told the story of how the person you were looking to just packed up and left, and that may have been his response to the pressures of this type of life. Jared Wilson's response was suicide. Other people's response is to quit. And then some people learn to sort of cope or deal with it, but they'll have some other moral failure in response to that, to the depth of that feeling there. So how do people, how what is a balance for a faith leader? Like, how do you deal with that pressure?
Yeah. I can't speak to this as if I have it mastered myself, but I can tell you there's at least two layers, if not more than that. So first, I think an unusual one that I don't know that we spend enough time on is thinking about it as a system itself. That the church itself is an organized system. And I'm thinking of just one fixed address, right? It's got its own moods. It's got its own kind of culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's got adults that are regularly a vulnerable child. It's got adults that are regularly the angry child.
Yes.
And they don't even know they will need to be soothed and to be validated. And once it happens, they're like, and I'm talking about people get all fussy because somebody left a crumb in the kitchen and now we're going to burn the building down. You know what I'm saying? And so these
absolutely.
people are, so these are all part of any group, right? So as a group, we have to come. So not just the leader, but the leaders. So whether it's the church board, and I'm Episcopalian, so we call it a vestry. How does that vestry partner with clergy, with the pastor, so that it is a collective load and not an elevated role for one person? Because one person alone is a recipe for burnout, right? And I think the perfect analogy for burnout is destroying your soul so that you can achieve some noble purpose. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not backwards. People think you get burnt out by doing things you don't like to do. No, you're burning into your own soul, doing something you think you're supposed to be doing. So that's the recipe. So I think at a systems level, we have to manage and talk openly about expectations of those that are in these roles, right? And then privately to those leaders. Your question ended up in a different direction, but one of the first words you said in it was avoid. So how do we avoid the depths? Well, that was kind of one of the first things I was hearing you say, and it ended up being a little bit different. But I imagine right away people wanting to know, how do I avoid being depressed? How do I avoid being suicidal? And my practical answer to you is you cannot. Because sadness is a God-given emotion. Fear is a God-given emotion. Now, fear is probably the most pathologized one by Christian discussion, because it's often a commandment. Fear not, don't be afraid. But what we forget is when those things happen, it's usually because the person hearing that message, right? Hearing that message doesn't understand other facts, right? So they are afraid because of the facts they think are true. Sure. And the message is, don't be afraid. Like, that's told to Joseph, it's told to Mary. So we're in the Advent season, so I'm very influenced by Advent. But it's because they don't get all the facts, right? Sure. Well, in life, we don't get all the facts either. And fear keeps us alive, keeps us safe. Yes. And going past that kind of fear and into chronic fear, I mean, those are real suffering conditions. So the trouble is, we set it up so that we create a leader that's a little bit isolated. We put them on a pedestal. We act like they're not normal and typical and have the same kind of trappings that we do. And then
Mm-hmm.
they have a legitimate reaction to their life experience. They're
Mm-hmm.
anxious, they're depressed, they're prone to it because of family history, they're prone to it because of their life. Um, and then they become very, very sad. And we think, isn't that a shame? And so then we heap actual shame onto these people
Mm-hmm.
rather than recognizing that all of the things that have been discussed, right? Depression, anxiety, these are treatable things.
Right.
They are
Right.
not things that will leave you forever, right? And they are the appropriate responses to many of life's ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
And even with suicide, I would love to have, and I hate to have to say the word love, but in this, but we need an honest conversation about evaluating suicide risk in Christian ministry,
Absolutely.
because we should not have people who cannot self-disclose that I'm having passive, which is I just wish I wouldn't wake up. They have intent, like they've been thinking about, like it would be great to
Absolutely.
do something to, to end this. Means. So when we add these up, there are validated tools that exist in the social sciences. The Columbia Scale for Suicide Risks, probably the world's famous, that walks through evaluating somebody in front of you. And we normally
Mm-hmm.
think of this as like a clergy person should be evaluating others, but we need to be having that discussion for everyone,
Yeah.
because
That's
because
absolutely right.
because suicide, here's the facts, right? Suicide, the ideation around it is more common than people realize,
Sure.
and it's typically um, more completed suicide is more common for men because they tend to pick more violent means
Mm-hmm.
to do it. So we end up thinking that it's really a male problem or a veteran problem or these other types. In reality, it's a human condition, right? You can tell a
Mm-hmm.
story in any culture at any time, and people will know what you're talking about with suicide,
Mm-hmm.
because that is the depths of human despair. And again, back to this message of Christ and the cross in the garden. God is um, is present and identifies with the victim, with those that suffer. So when you are anxious and you are depressed, you are in that space that Jesus was in and of himself. And we benefit in so many ways from modern life. We have the insight to treat these things. But I would
Yeah.
absolutely say managing that kind of risk is something that should be a discussion, because
Absolutely.
not only is the issue itself a problem, but we are heaping stigma and shame on top of it so that
Mm-hmm.
people feel like they can't discuss it. And that's the thing. God gave us emotions, whether we want to recognize it or not. And
Right.
they
Right.
provide us very important data. And the wisdom of others, whether a trained professional or a wise friend, can really help us tease out those emotions. And emotions are not the enemy. The emotions are typically the
Right.
trail end of our thinking patterns, and they are the trail end of our interpretations of our life. And so they are our understandable reactions to the way that we're seeing life, and in some cases, the events of our life.
Man, you are a thought. you are you are definitely a thought. There's a lot of thought leadership that you have. Um, I throw this question at everybody because we're coming to our the time, but I throw this question at a lot of people when I ask what you if you've watched a bunch of To the End. I always ask a lot of different
Okay.
questions. But one of the questions I have, and I definitely want to get your thoughts, is how do you what about the world? If you could change something about the world, if you had a Morgan Freeman and Jim Carrey moment, and and God said to you, you can, you've got the power to change one thing about the world. What do you think that thing would be?
Man, there's so many that are popping through my head, but I think the one that speaks tonight as a male who lives in the United States, who grew up in a police officer's household that is 80% to a second master's degree in social work, who is trying to be, somebody who is committed to the scriptures and Christianity and to living healthy and having dialogues like this. I mean, my honest answer today is to teach, particularly men, but young people, empathy and to help people understand that part of God's heartbeat is identifying with the emotional state and the suffering of the world.
Sure.
It's not to step aside from it and to condemn it.
Yep.
The easier thing to do is to hand out a few bucks or a blanket to basically go on a dressed up vacation and call it a mission trip,
Right.
or to enter real empathy where you are seeing the person across from you as no different than you,
Yeah.
who experiences the ups and downs with you, who has something to teach and something to learn from you. And ultimately, not just the empathy toward others, but just back to our clergy discussion and our leadership discussion. Can we cultivate the space? And I think I'm talking to men because I'm talking to me right now. Can you create the space in you to care for your own wounds, to both the physical, the emotional, the social? And if we cultivate that in us and in our neighbor, I can't help but think that our priorities as a country and as a world or political system or whatever it happens to be the most important way to answer that for you, that those priorities wouldn't be different.
Yeah. Man, listen, this cannot be the last time that we have
Okay.
with this discussion.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot more stuff like we've been at it for an hour, but there's a lot more stuff that I would love to pull from you. I think a lot of people will learn, a lot of people in my circle or in my, in my viewership would learn, from just, asking more questions and listen to you speak. But I want you to tell us how to get in touch with, maybe listening to your podcast, because I know you've done, ton of episodes on your podcast, and how to get in touch with you. I definitely
Yes.
want to put that information here so different people can go, hear some more about your thoughts and your, what you got to share with the world.
Thank you. I appreciate your compliment. It means a lot. It feels good to hear that. And to know that, I think for anybody listening, like when we have things to share like this, they're all the byproducts of our life so far. So everything you're going through, good and bad, is going to produce some nugget of compassion and wisdom for you that you can offer to the world and give to yourself. So my podcast is Practice Makes Presence. You can find it anywhere that you get podcasts. So if you like iTunes, Stitcher, whatever app you use, you can find it there, or at practicemakespresence.com. And my contact information is in there. And I am Maddie and AZ on Twitter and Instagram. So you can find me at both of those.
I'm going to definitely have that. We're going to definitely put that on the screen for everyone. Man, Matt, thank you so much for being a part. Thank you for sharing. This has been a very, very insightful Elevation podcast, and it embodied what the vision is for this podcast to elevate so whoever listening to another level. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on, and this definitely cannot be our last conversation because
I agree. I appreciate it so much. I love what you're doing here. It's important work, and I was glad to be here. It's my pleasure.
Thanks so much, man. This has been the Elevation Podcast. This is, we've been sitting here talking to Matt Sandoval. And thank you so much for being here. And we will see you guys next Tuesday, 7:30, or, go to ShawnRiff-Raff.com, watch all the episodes of the Elevation Podcast, or anywhere you, listen to podcasts. Thanks so much. Peace out. When I was 20 years old, I started one of the first multi-artist gospel rap labels in the country. Who listens to that, they said. That has no future is what they told me. That's a dead end, they kept repeating. That's a career killer, they warned me. What they didn't understand is that a pioneer can see past what you think is possible and has the endurance to push it through. And my new media television platform is that pioneer's mind at work once again. I give the unheard a voice. I give the marginalized a stage. And I give the unfortunate a good hand. This is Christian media like you've never seen it before. Because this is Shawn Riff-Raff Studios.
I'm a Christian with $100 million vision. Can nobody box me and say that's a contradiction? Goal driven, God just blessed me with the ambition. Look up when the rest, he rests the definition. Been through hell, but the fire couldn't crisp them. Shut down the mouths of anybody, you dismissed them. 20 years gospel rap broke all the traditions. Cause from a teenager, I was on the same mission. So when he running God business, he got clothing, plus he got the boss with him. He got a squad with him, real no frauds with him. He run into the light cause he is an optimist. When everybody